science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are listening to Architecture Talk. It's getting to be summer and I am on the East Coast with my friend Satish, and today I am bringing you a great conversation with a professor from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, Aneesha Dharwadker, and what we are discussing is an extension to New Delhi's main symbolic highway, the Central Vista project, its design, its politics, and of course, its history. It's a great conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Here we go. So welcome to Architecture Talk, Aneesha. So excited to have you here.
Thank you.
I was forwarded your article that's just been published in Places, which is called Dystopia's Ghost. And the subline is that the remaking of New Delhi's Central Vista provokes troubling questions about colonialism and nationalism, and about the already fraught relationship between architecture and power. And you have done as I read this, 12, 14 pages of small print with lots of good pictures. A fantastic job of both providing width, in the sense of you provide context for all the issues that are being discussed, provide the history of colonization, you link it to economic mercantile exploitation, you give a history of architectural exegesis in the context of colonization, you set up Narendra Modi, you set up the history of New Delhi and Lutyens and Baker, and then you set up its stated or unstated target, which is Nehruvian modernism. And in that context, of course, you talk about Chandigarh, where I note you, of course, have a little bit of a discussion of having met my father, who helped sustain, I guess, the myth of Chandigarh, which you now look to deconstruct and undo. But I've been thinking about this, and basically, what is your argument, let's say, against Modi's dramatic redesign of, and we'll go into the history and context and background all later, but just cut to the chase.
Yeah.
What's the problem?
Yeah. So one is very practical, that it is costing an enormous amount of money, and it will cost an enormous amount of resources, and ultimately produce an enormous carbon footprint.
Mm-hmm.
So
you haven't said that in the paper. You didn't talk about the carbon footprint.
No, I think that was maybe a little bit implied, especially when I discussed the proposals that were part of the competition, mm-hmm. and the sort of the way that they were really leaning into this idea of a new icon for India, and that automatically translates into something that is big, something that is monumental, something that is grand, something that inspires awe, right? It's this kind of the neoliberal sublime.
Right.
So that is the very practical dimension.
That's another phrase you did use, neoliberal sublime. I love it. You're much more, free-flowing in oral. I
think I might have used that in another paper actually from a couple of years ago, so I can send you that too.
All right.
But there is the historic preservation dimension. And I will say that I am not, I don't have kind of like an orthodox position on this at all, like personally. I think there are times at which historic preservation is appropriate and, you know, times at which perhaps it is not. I don't think that just because something exists necessarily means that it needs to be held up or maintained.
No, of course not.
You know, and I mean, that's sort of like that's a position I take on many things beyond buildings. But I do think that in this case, and just to kind of summarize what's going on in Delhi, there is basically a historic government zone in the center of Delhi that was designed and built by the British between 1911 and 1931. And it's, you know, so many resources were put into it because I think there was sort of an underlying assumption that the British Raj, the colonial regime, was going to last longer than 1947.
Right.
So an entire sort of mini city was built in this zone. And it contained buildings for all of the sort of governmental functions. Mm-hmm. And after the partition, after independence, that it became the seat of the new Indian government, the parliament. And so those buildings are now basically under threat. They are being framed by the Modi administration as a kind of colonial stain on India, as symbols of colonial power, which in one sense they are. But the response that the administration is taking at the moment is to say, well, what these require is a kind of wholesale demolition, a complete reconstruction, using, you know, architectural idioms that are really not that different from the existing buildings. There's a lot of kind of
hold on, let me interrupt you. The entire sort of literature I've read coming out of HCP is the reverse. It's all about preservation and sort of maintaining the integrity of the Lachans Causeway. From my perspective, the argument's the reverse, that they are reinforcing the colonial lines.
So this is like one of the fundamental contradictions, because if you look at the kind of fine print of the multi-page, it wasn't quite an RFP, it was more like an invitation
it was
for
a scam competition. We all know that.
Exactly. But if you look at the text in there, it's all about making a new India. How do we reinvent India for a future that is not constrained by our colonial past, mm-hmm. right? So to me, there is a very fundamental.
I thought, as you point out, the target is not constrained by our Nehruvian past.
Well, so then this is, I feel like we're sort of unwrapping a lot of the very deep contradictions of this particular administration as well. Because you want to leave the colonial history behind, because India it's not just emerging, it's emerged, right? Yeah. So you want to leave that history behind. And so one way to do it, one way to sort of create an excuse for this demolition is to say that we want to get rid of this so that we can kind of modernize the entire Indian government. Mm-hmm. They use a lot of the same sort of spatial tropes that are like very highly visible in the existing buildings in New Delhi. Proportions, colors, materials, the kind of arcaded conditions, fenestration patterns, like there's a lot of repetition there. Mm-hmm. And so that's one thing, right? But then there's also, well, like we are not a secular nation, and Nehru's major imprint in the kind of construction of the national identity post-partition was that he created a secular government. Mm-hmm. And so there are two things that are kind of somewhat in conflict with each other that are both trying to be abandoned. But there's only one very blunt tool that is being used now by the Modi administration, which is demolition of pieces of architecture, not just by British architects during the British Raj period, but also by Indian modernists like Raj Raval, mm-hmm. Who's had multiple buildings demolished in the last few years in
right.
Pragati Maidan.
Right.
So I think that what we, as people who think about architecture, people who think about India, need to sort of consider is what other tools are available. And it's possible that demolition is appropriate in some cases. I mean, just from a very practical standpoint, like if there are life safety issues, you have to deal with that. But if it is a purely ideological stance that is producing this kind of as producing an image of India where architecture stands in for development, and that demolition and reconstruction automatically mean progress.
Yeah.
I think that is a problem.
Yeah, no, but let's, rather than generalize this question of preservation versus demolition and reconstruction, I want to spend a little bit of time on what you're describing as these not constitutive, sort of problematic contradictions. I mean, clearly, as you are correctly pointing out, the redevelopment of Central Vista, while it pretends to be, a pragmatic problem of needing more square feet for the burgeoning Indian government, is designed to make a major statement of new arrival, right? That now there is a new nation state, and the new nation state is Modi Sarkar. And Modi Sarkar is Hindutva secularism. And Hindutva secularism places India at par on the world stage, right? And that somehow, this placing Hindutva secularism or at par on the world stage equals making quote unquote world-class architecture. Yes, this is the common phrase. And somehow this equals Central Vista redevelopment.
Yes, but the underlying narrative that I think so many people find problematic is that goes hand in hand with violence. Right. So there is an architectural violence, and there is the absolutely unabashed support of violence against Muslims in India. And so to me, the fact that there is that underlying narrative that has so much evidence already, and that this ultimately is a kind of manifestation of different forms of violence, and that architecture is being abused in a sense as a way to represent those positions and to consolidate those positions. And then ultimately, once that architecture is produced, it's going to be a form of celebrating those positions in its monumentality, right? In its newness, in the fact that it's going to have, air conditioning and interior waterfalls and private offices for everyone, and these sort of like grand houses for the two houses of parliament. I think that is what I find so insulting about this whole undertaking, is that architecture is being used as a kind of weapon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, at one level, one can think of facilities. It's a facilities upgrade. I mean, it's like the cricket stadiums. I mean, I remember when Mr. Wadekar, not Wadkar, was leading the Indian cricket team in the 1970s and even the 80s when Kapil Dev and Gavaskar were leading it. Our stadiums were abysmal, right?
Yeah.
And then they got upgraded to being as good as MCG or Lord's.
Mm-hmm.
And now everybody loves our super fancy stadiums.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, the pragmatic argument is, well, we just need fancy government buildings also, right?
Yeah.
So why should our ministries be anything less than anybody else's ministries, right? So they should be super air conditioned and everything because there's now like that. India is world class.
Mhm.
But you are linking all this to sort of a global sort of totalitarian kind of visions of doing things. You quote Bolsonaro, you brought in Donald Trump. Is there a specific connection between kind of the strongmen architecture and this kind of redevelopment? I mean, what do you think? Why do this strongmen architecture not like modern architecture? Why do they?
Yeah, good question. I think that it maybe stems from I'm gonna borrow a term from an Indian architect and journalist, A.G. Krishna Menon, who I actually had an opportunity to interview while I was writing this article. What he calls architectural illiteracy. It's this kind of really simplistic understanding of what buildings are and what buildings can do and what buildings mean. And so for me, the commonality between these strongmen is that for them, architecture is mostly, if not wholly, symbolic. That it captures a single moment in time, it is mute, it is fixed. And I think that having spent so much time thinking about architecture, having had an architectural education, now having taught architecture for so many years, that there's also one could think of buildings as the opposite as well. That despite the fact that they are fixed in the ground, there is fluidity to their meaning. And there are multiple interpretations are possible.
Yeah.
And I think that, so for me, the commonality between all of these people who are kind of using architecture as a proxy for their power, their kind of, I would say, narrow visions of what the world can look like, what the built environment can be, it really underestimates what architecture can actually do and what architecture is. And the fact that architecture is fundamentally something that shapes the public. It shapes everyone's world. And I have sort of said this in many contexts, and I feel like maybe it's appropriate to say here too, but there's not a single person on the planet who does not have some kind of relationship to architecture and landscape. And whether that means you are included or sheltered by architecture, or whether that means you are excluded by it, whether that means you participate in its production or you are affected by its production. It is one of the most pervasive conditions that we have on the planet.
I mean, there's a reason why it's food, clothing, and shelter, right?
Right, exactly.
I say it's fashion. No, it's chefs, fashion designers, and architects. This is the basics of life.
Yeah, and it's funny how little that the basics of life then translate into what those people do as professions, because it ends up being all of the things you mentioned are seen as kind of luxuries, right? Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think that the fact that it is such a pervasive condition and that every single person on the planet has, some kind of relationship to it, that means that the meaning of it is going to change. And so to kind of take this position that architecture can only mean one thing, and that ultimately it's about representing forms of power, I think that is something that is, it has certainly impacted an enormous amount of architecture in the past. We live with a lot of the buildings that were produced during lots of regimes that thought about architecture this way. But we have access to more information than we have ever been able to access in our history. We have more access to more perspectives from individuals than we have ever been able to have. And so this kind of totally retrograde understanding of what architecture is, that is what I have a problem with. There is so much potential. There is so much ingenuity in India.
I mean, because I completely agree with you that architecture is a fact of life. Let me summarize one of your theses, right? And because it's a sort of a everyday inhabited, constantly changing event of life rather than fact of life, it's more of a verb rather than a noun. Uh, because of that, it is like language, inherently unstable in the sense that it's constantly being reappropriated, rewritten, and misunderstood and reunderstood and misrepresented, and then adaptively reused, let's say, and so on. But because of that, it is also imbricated with nostalgia, with search for lost meaning, with the possibility, conversely, of domination and control, right? So there is always this tendency in language, as in inhabited architecture, to try and control the inherent and inevitable instability of its inhabitation or of language by trying to produce fixity of meaning, which is how monumental architecture comes into play, right?
Exactly.
But that's not a new thing. We have been doing
it's
that
not.
with the Romans and the Mughals and the Chinese and the everybody has tries to do it again and again. And the Grand Projets in Paris, and that's what the mall is. There's no difference.
Yep.
Which is why Dr. King showed up on the mall, because he wanted to take over a monumental axis and make a statement, right? So it's no surprise to have somebody who fashions themselves on Putin wanting to make a big grand project.
Yeah. It's no surprise at all. I just think that there needs to be a dialogue about it.
Oh, because you believe in
Yeah.
democracy. What's wrong with you?
Yeah, right. Silly me.
Silly you, silly. No, but okay. So that's an intention, and that for me it therefore explains why he wants to align up with neocolonialism, because that was the intention, as you pointed out, of the colonial project. 1911 to 1931, when they were building New Delhi, it was to produce a clear manifestation of the quote unquote benefits of empire, right? Clear manifestation of what great administration and authority can do for you, which is different, or is it, from the ideas of secular democracy that Nehru tried to embody complexly, let's say, with Corbusier, etc., in Chandigarh, or is it the same?
Well, I think that might require us to unpack Chandigarh a little bit, because of the way in which that city materially manifested. Right, the way that the plan ultimately came together, the way that the buildings ultimately looked. I think there's we haven't talked about this yet, but there's this sort of aesthetic dimension to all of this. And that's why it was actually really important for me to talk about this in the article a little bit, because there are these it's basically the construction of, the construction of the Capitol as a site of government functioning and authority, and the ways that the activities of the government get organized in the landscape, and how they become housed in buildings, and the ways in which that happened in New Delhi, that happened in Chandigarh, and then it's now being rethought in the same space in Delhi again. And the contrasts between when you have either a colonial or an authoritarian government doing this versus a government that is secular and democratic. And I think what's really interesting for me is you have these two very different types of leadership and perspective on what government can and should be doing, and then that manifests in the built environment in a certain way. And I think that it's really
And what are these
interesting
two
that,
different? What are the two different interpretations?
well, so yeah, and so that's what's really interesting is that, so with the colonial government, you have long axes, right? Very clear intersections. You have the ability to surveil down a street if you want to. You are creating the framework for long ceremonial processions, right? So it's kind of, there's the it's axial. This is kind of like classic English, French axial planning, right? Then you think about Chandigarh, where the idea of democracy is kind of translated into the grid. The aesthetics are what eventually became known as brutalism. There's a use of a very different set of materials. It's cast in place concrete. There's color, sort of painted color as opposed to kind of like the natural color of limestone. So there are the physical manifestations of these cities are quite different. And so the question for me, and I didn't really have an opportunity to tease this out so much in this article because there were many other things that sort of needed explication. But the question for me is like, was Chandigarh inherently a more successful city in terms of not only how it functioned, but the meanings that it kind of accumulated over time?
When I was growing up in Chandigarh in the 70s and 80s, early 80s, before you were born in 1986, I learned, the year I came to the US. Postmodernism held up Chandigarh as the whipping boy of badness. If Jane Jacobs and Louis Mumford and then later Charles Jenks and company had an object of critique, or even people like Bogey Menon, A.G.K. Menon, and the Delhi postmodernists, Romy Khosla, etc., even Gautam Bhatia, their target was Chandigarh. And the Nehruvian state was widely criticized, I'm talking pre-Modi years, by the liberal left establishment throughout, as a colossal failure, as imperialist, as top-down, and the exact thing that the NGO sector said we shouldn't be doing. So by that accounting, there is no difference between Lachan's New Delhi, Corbusier's Chandigarh, and Mr. Modi's New Delhi. Would you agree with that?
No. Instinctively, no. Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really tough question, actually, because Chandigarh is also an expression of power. Yeah, and Chandigarh is also fundamentally an expression of power.
Of course.
And I think that, like, the question is like, did Nehru's personality and his approach to shaping India, creating a new national identity, defining what that is, defining the new relationship between the citizen and the state that had been decimated over the previous few centuries, is that a catalyst? Is that enough of a catalyst to make Chandigarh a different kind of city? And for me, that's not a question that I can answer. And I'm actually really interested to hear what your perspective on this is, having spent so much time there and being so intimately connected to the city.
I'm biased, but I do think there is a constitutive difference.
Yeah.
I mean, if we go back to architecture as the symbolic sphere, as the built symbolic sphere, as built language, then the kind of super axial productions, we could start with Washington, D.C., but let's be polemical and start with Albert Speer under the Nazis. And while he was doing that, Lachans was designing New Delhi, both comparable projects, but not the same. Again, there's a difference there, and one can argue about the differences. And this is a discussion that ran between Nehru Gandhi versus Subhash Chandra Bose, and et cetera, right? And there is a difference. But the objective of making clear architecture, which is well organized on axis with terminal projects, is intended to shut down interpretation and make clear propagandist messages, right? Whereas I would argue a project like Chandigarh, and my new book on Chandigarh, which should hopefully come out next year, will argue this, that Chandigarh's capital complex and even the city deals with the necessity of producing, big meaning, big symbolic monuments, government, without shutting down discourse. And indeed, in some ways, making sure that discourse constantly threatens those monuments, constantly tends to bring them down.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Better than I could have put it. Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the question for me, because obviously I have spent much less time in Chandigarh, is, did that happen? Was it successful in framing those dialogues?
Yeah. And as you pointed out in your article, it's an open question. Was the Nehruvian state a failure? Because its socialist aspirations, the gap that you quote between its visions and the actual implementation of its bureaucracy, there was Pogi Menon's point in your paper, wasn't it, about the illiteracy, about or was it Pogi Menon? Somebody you quoted as the gap between the lofty ideals of the Indian Constitution and the pocket lining politics of the politicians.
Yeah. Might have been Pankaj Mishra.
Pankaj Mishra, you're right.
Yeah.
Pankaj Mishra, yes. Who is also an astute scholar, right?
Yeah.
So that was a gap. But, I was talking to Sunil Khilnani. I did a 4-part, I don't know if you heard that, with him and Partha Mitter and Vidler and Mark Jasambek. It's unclear what Khilnani's current politics are, but in part he was saying, well, democracy is viceversa. It's sort of this is the exact test of democracy, the Nehruvian democracy that we are going through. When you talk about making democratic government in a way that is constantly threatened by the public, this is what it looks like.
Yeah.
So we will see if we survive this test.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I also think that you can't discount the impact of what the British did over the previous 2.5 centuries. Because India's not just living with the legacy of Nehru, it's living with the legacy of everything before that. And so I think that considering that the issues that India has now, just to kind of take, for example, the British extraction of natural resources, right? The kind of the stealing of goods and labor in India, obviously in a very different way than that happened in the United States. But there has not been a recovery from that. And I think that it is, so I think that sort of considering what the Nehruvian legacy is also has to take all of that into account. And so when we're talking about the sort of relative failures or successes of Chandigarh, I think that is kind of a, to kind of play off the title of my paper, that's one of the specters as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, the Pankaj Mishra quote, where he talks about uh, 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 the lofty ideals being basically wasted away through the corruption of the bureaucracy and the ministers. Growing up as a child, I used to think, oh my God, this is the failure of the Indian imagination, particularly the Indian upwardly mobile middle class imagination, that their whole goal is not on the ideals of democracy, but just how to quickly make a buck and send their kids to the United States, which is what we all did. But then later on, I realized, actually, in more studying in grad school, that actually corruption was institutionalized in colonization. Every institution that was put up was laced with corruption. That is how business was done throughout the colonial administration, which is what continued. So the Nehruvian vision to really put a state at the helm of a progressivist modernism was running against that tide, which survived the colonial and the end of British rule, right? So I think you're right. I mean, in the sense that, of course, the core line is economic exploitation, right?
Yeah.
That through the problem with colonization was not that we were colonized, but that colonization happened exactly at the same time as industrialization and modernization, and India and the rest of the colonies were asymmetrically kept out of it in a big way.
Yeah, I mean, another way to say that is colonization produced industrialization and modernization.
They were constitutively connected. They possibly would never have happened without exploitative resource extraction, right? Yes, and you give discussion about cotton, and it could be said about many other things, right?
Yeah, and that's actually what Amitav Ghosh has written about so beautifully recently, kind of like looking at the history of spices and spice movement, spice extraction, right. And the kind of tying that to bigger issues of climate change. His work is really, really incredible.
Right. But with colonization, the super damaging thing about it all was clearly Eurocentrism. Because while this project was going on, which was clearly exploitative and asymmetrical, the purport sold was that we are bringing modernity and Western civilization to you, and you are backward and inferior, which was always a nonsense, Orientalism, etc. But the internalization of that is what we find now in Hindutva Modi Sarkar, which is simply a repudiation of that argument, which is like, no, we were always great and we are still great, and that's what makes everything great, and you guys have it wrong. So it's a funny contradiction to as you were pointing out, that the repudiation of the colonial and the repudiation of the Nehruvian as neo-colonial is done by taking the form of re-emphasizing a sort of colonialist architectural idiom.
Yes, exactly.
And presenting it as if it is not colonial. Whereas in its affect and power, it is totally colonial. It's a strange moment.
It's a very strange moment. And I have to say, having grown up in the United States, the issue of the kind of lofty ideals versus the reality on the ground is deeply present here as well.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it's not, it's not possible for the wealthiest nation on the planet to escape that contradiction either.
Yeah, and this is one thing I took an issue with in your article.
Mm-hmm.
You read, imagine this happening on the mall, somebody doing it. That's what Mr. Trump exactly wanted to do. I mean, he would do it in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
He would wipe out all the modernism in Washington, D.C. and replace it with his own version of, so that would totally happen here too. It's that, it's very real.
Yeah, I mean, if we didn't have term limits, I can imagine, and that was really kind of about emergence into that kind of power and then consolidation of that power, which is essentially what Modi is doing in India now. Yeah, for
It
sure.
could totally happen here. But it also, think of Prince Charles in the UK. He would happily do all this. Don't you think?
I don't know him.
Well, before you were born, Prince Charles was the #1 champion of new urbanism.
Is that right?
Yes, Leon Creer was his architect, and he vociferously talked about the ugliness of modern architecture and brutalism. He still does.
That's incredible. I know I had not followed his. I don't think I've heard him speak out loud for a very long time. I have not followed his positions on design.
Doddery old man now, but Boris Johnson, rides that same sentiment.
It turns my stomach to think about Boris Johnson, but we can go there.
Boris Johnson, the issue is not these big testosterone men. They are symptoms of larger things, right? I mean, architecture is a bellwether in that sense. I mean, it's like there's something deeply wrong.
Yeah, the fact that it can be misused and subverted and made to be more symbolic than it needs to be or should be. Like the ease with which it can be subverted was quite astonishing.
It is. And it's the opposite of the is it the opposite of the Joyce project? I mean, so to give a little context for those who are listening, Aneesha did her, she went to Cornell, first of all, which is the finest university for architecture, as we all know. No need to discuss that any further. You did your thesis on Joyce, Ulysses in particular, a high modernist text, and tried to spatialize that in architecture. And, without your thesis went in a particular direction. But if we just stay with Ulysses for a moment, it's a novel that celebrates the instability of language and instability and the multiplicity of the possibilities of form. Is it not?
That's absolutely correct. Yes.
You described it as a designed work. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. So Ulysses is the overall structure comes from the Odyssey. So the chapters are named after chapters in the Odyssey, and each of those becomes a metaphor that plays out in sort of real life in modern day Dublin. So the book is set on a single day in 1908, and it was published in 1922. So it's very much kind of in that period when modernism was just blossoming in multiple disciplines, architecture being one of them, and poetry and novels being another major one. And each chapter ultimately kind of starts to take on a different form, especially as you kind of progress through the book. And so you start out with prose, what one in a very, very loose definition might call prose. There's sort of a traceable narrative at the beginning. And then as you progress through the book, you start to kind of, at times you lose the English language completely. At times you're reading a prose text that then becomes a play, or a chapter that's entirely constructed out of newspaper headlines.
What's the point behind this? Why is he just trying to why doesn't he just say it straight?
Yeah. Well, I think that for me, the way that I read this is that text is about form and content. I mean, this was such a sort of critical question for all the modernists kind of working across different media, is what is the relationship between form and content? And so for Joyce, it becomes about that the narrative is the form. And so, or the form is the narrative in a sense, there is kind of a symbiosis between those two things. And so he doesn't need to tell you a straight story, because he's telling you the straight story in the way that he is putting the words together, if that makes sense. And so I guess another way to say that in a more familiar way is that the medium is the message. And so for him, the book is not.
And what is his message in this sort of multi-forms of his formal claims?
Yeah. I think there's a couple key ones. I think the first is that artistic production can't happen in a vacuum. And his the character who sort of represents him as a young man, Stephen Daedalus, he begins the story as this kind of what I would call sort of a trapped artist, or an artist who is trapped in his own mind, someone who is totally convinced of his own potential, but has not figured out a way to express what it is that he wants to express. And in this case, he's a writer. And what he needs is this experience over the course of a day in Dublin, kind of immersed in the city and slowly kind of making his way towards this climactic encounter with Leopold Bloom, who is the kind of archetypal father figure. And so it's the meeting of the father who is missing the son and the son who is missing the father. And that meeting that kind of ultimately spurs the sort of artistic production and creativity within the younger character. So I think that is one message. There are other messages that are, I would say, less eloquent and a bit more visceral, that have to do with relationships between husbands and wives, and relationships between the individual and the body. There's a lot of kind of play that Joyce does with the aesthetics of the things that also kind of disgust us, or things that we normally think about as very private, that he turns into these kind of public and nuanced, and in some ways eloquent, and in some ways very ineloquent essential elements of the story. And so there is this kind of bodily aesthetic that runs through the whole story as well. And so I think that there's the kind of the high and the low that get merged, really, I mean, in my opinion, very successfully in this book. And I think that the way that he is able to take those narratives and then represent them in the different forms, and in this kind of manipulation and subversion of the English language, that is what kind of makes this the sort of classic modernist text, but also, some people argue, the last modernist text. Ulysses is often cited as the last novel, because he destroyed the genre. he destroyed it, and then it was left to everyone else to sort of pick up the pieces and try and put it back together.
So let's
That's a
start.
long answer to your question.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's beautiful. Because, of course, when he was writing this and this book was being banned and starting to be read, is exactly when Albert Speer was designing his stuff and Edwin Lutyens was designing New Delhi. It was the same time. So in terms of things and their contexts, it is important to remember that modernism was always at battle with, some would argue in cahoots with, neo-imperialism and neo-colonialism of various kinds. And we know of Heidegger's complex relationship with, for instance, National Socialism as well. And later on, the postmodernists did not hesitate to connect modernism to fascism. Tirani worked for first. The Italian fascists, worked closely with modernism, for instance. But leaving that aside, actually, modernism, as you articulated in Joyce, set itself up with this really difficult task of both being a strong articulation of a new aesthetic genre, but did it in a manner that is designed to destabilize itself, right? Which is what I heard you say, as Joyce ended the modernist novel, because in a sense, that was the project, right? And Kerouac tries to take it up in different ways, and Ginsberg tries to take it up in poetics. Everybody tries to do this and that, but we are all struggling with it. So this broken down, this sort of broken down narrative, and I would argue Chandigarh is a broken down modernist city in this sense. I argue it as an incomplete project and a sort of an Umberto Eco open project, right? I mean, if we want to connect all these things, it is as a consequence of that it becomes vulnerable and becomes an opportune target for a destruction, literally, implosion. But B, as being blamed for being anemic and unforceful and without a vision, and therefore to be replaced by the strong men of Modi Sarkar and Putin, Boris, Bolsonaro, Trump. They are iconic anti-modern people because they say, look at that weak, anemic bullshit.
Because it's abstract.
And abstract.
Yeah, I think that the deconstruction that modernism was sort of fundamentally based on, people find very frightening. I think people continue to find it very frightening. Because I think because, as you said, it destabilizes what is familiar and comfortable.
Yes. It doesn't immediately say, yeah, you're wonderful. Just follow me and I will make you a princess. Yeah. It says, no, you're complicated and who knows what you're trying to do, and your unconscious might be in control with you. And you got to watch out, try and be responsive to the other, but try and keep your own. And who knows what's going to happen? You might lose.
It's much more
complicated. A very different lesson. Yeah, it's much more complicated, challenging, and self-threatening.
Yeah, right. I think that for me sorry, if we can sort of go back to the article.
Please.
For me, that the question at the end of it is not to say that things need to be preserved exactly as they are simply by virtue of them having already been built. It was not to say that at all. But the question is, how can you use architecture as a tool, as a medium, in a positive sense, to actually represent the largest democracy on the planet?
Yeah, How do you do it?
Because it's capable of doing that. It's not that architecture is not capable of it. It's just that we haven't designed the architecture that's capable of it yet.
We meaning modern India, or we meaning humanity?
Humanity.
Ah, lovely. So Aneesha is going to, you're setting yourself up there to have to do this. You realize that.
Well, I haven't gotten the drawing started yet, but I think that architecture is uniquely capable of taking that on because of the scale at which it works, because of the way the relationships between representation and the processes of design and how the built environment actually comes into being. I do think that it is like, of all the professions and fields and modes of thought that we have, I think architecture is uniquely capable of that. But it requires the political will, it requires the creative will to get there. And that is what is ultimately missing from this Central Vista redesign, is that like it's ultimately not really a redesign at all.
It's a reinforcement.
It's a reinforcement, exactly, with like new HVAC systems.
Yeah.
And I think that it is deeply cynical about what architecture can actually do. I think it's deeply cynical about the idea of democracy. And I think that it basically just, and I mean, this is sort of reinforced by all the evidence that we have from the way that the competition was actually carried out, and how the team was selected, and like how the plan actually came into being. It just completely ignores the potential of what a more thoughtful, a more ingenious, more creative architecture can do. And of course, like that can take on multiple forms. It doesn't have to look like anything that we already have, but you have to be willing to take the time to design it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for having this conversation with me. We will have to have another podcast and ask you about how do we find the time and what would we do to design, even if conceptually, in absence of the political will or in anticipation of the political will. And I will ask you, what happened? There you were modernist projects of great political will.
Yeah.
So we'll have to have that as another conversation. But thank you so much for writing this. This is an important article. As you know, this is a huge ongoing discussion, at least in India. And I think it's a bellwether of discussions that are, around the corner in the world. I think the totalitarianization of public space is something that we are likely to see a push towards more and more of as these strong men continue to gain power. So we need to work together to have an alternative perspective. So I'll come back to that conversation with you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is your producer, Amelia Jarvinen. We hope you enjoyed the conversation, and if you did, please subscribe and rate us on iTunes or Spotify. We would also love to hear from you if you have any suggestions on new topics or guests. You can always reach out to us on our website, Facebook, or Instagram. Thanks again, and until next time, this is Architecture Talk.